Have you ever wondered how a small island nation managed to build the largest empire in history and become fabulously wealthy? It's a story of ambition, innovation, and a whole lot of tea. So how did the British Empire become the richest power the world had ever seen? Let's dive in. Our story begins not with kings and queens, but with merchants and adventurers. In the 17th century, the British East India Company was formed. It was more than just a company. It was a private army, a government, and a trading giant all rolled into one. Initially, they were after spices from the East Indies, but they soon set their sights on a much bigger prize: India. India at the time was a land of immense wealth, famous for its textiles, spices, and precious gems. The British East India Company started by setting up trading posts, but through a mix of clever politics and military force, they gradually took control. They exploited local rivalries and eventually defeated the ruling Mughal Empire. This wasn't just a conquest, it was a corporate takeover on an epic scale. India became the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, and its vast resources began to flow back to Britain. Cotton, indigo, tea, and opium were exported in massive quantities, generating enormous profits. The wealth extracted from India was a critical fuel for Britain's own industrial revolution. Speaking of the Industrial Revolution, this was Britain's next secret weapon. Starting in the late 18th century, Britain became the world's first industrial nation. Inventions like the steam engine, the spinning jenny, and new iron-making techniques transformed the country. Factories sprung up, producing textiles, machinery, and all sorts of goods faster and cheaper than anywhere else. Suddenly, Britain wasn't just taking resources from its colonies, it was turning them into finished products and selling them back to a captive market. Think of it like this: Britain would import raw cotton from India or its American colonies, process it in the factories of Manchester, and then sell the finished cloth back to India and the rest of the world. It was a hugely profitable cycle. The empire provided both the raw materials and the customers. The famous phrase, "the workshop of the world," was no exaggeration. British engineering and manufacturing were unparalleled. But how do you move all these goods around a global empire? The answer lies at sea: the Royal Navy. For centuries, Britain invested heavily in its navy, and by the 19th century it was untouchable. "Britannia rules the waves" was a statement of fact. This naval supremacy protected Britain's trade routes from pirates and rival powers, ensuring that its merchant ships could sail safely from London to Sydney, from Calcutta to the Caribbean. The Navy was the backbone of the empire, the guarantor of its global trade network. This network was vast. Let's take a trip around the world, British Empire style. In the Caribbean, lucrative sugar plantations, originally worked by enslaved Africans, generated immense fortunes for British owners. In North America, colonies provided timber, fur, and tobacco. After the American Revolution, Britain turned its attention to Canada and later established colonies in Australia and New Zealand, which became major producers of wool and agricultural goods. In Africa, Britain sought valuable resources like gold, diamonds in the south, and palm oil in the west. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century saw Britain carve out huge territories, all to secure more resources and markets. Even China was forced open. When Britain's demand for Chinese tea created a trade deficit, they began illegally exporting opium from India to China. This led to the Opium Wars, which resulted in Britain gaining Hong Kong and forcing China to open its ports to foreign trade. It was a ruthless but effective way to ensure the balance of trade was always in Britain's favour. Another crucial element was finance. The City of London became the financial capital of the world. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency, much like the US dollar is today. British banks financed projects all over the globe, from railways in Argentina to mines in South Africa. This financial dominance meant that even countries not officially part of the empire were often economically tied to Britain. This system, often called informal empire, allowed Britain to exert influence and extract wealth without the costs of direct rule. So let's put it all together. You have the immense resources and labor from colonies like India. You have the industrial might, to turn those resources into high-value goods. You have a dominant navy to protect the trade routes that connect it all. And you have the world's most sophisticated financial system to manage the profits and invest them for even greater returns. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of power and wealth. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire covered about a quarter of the world's land area and governed nearly a quarter of its population. The sun, as they said, truly never set on it. Of course, this story of wealth has another side. The prosperity of the empire was often built on the exploitation of its subjects. From the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade to the famines in India and the violent suppression of dissent, the cost for many people across the globe was immense. The riches that flowed into London, building grand buildings and funding lavish lifestyles, were often extracted at a terrible human price. It's a complex and often dark legacy that is still being debated and grappled with today. The decline of the empire after World War II was rapid. The economic cost of the wars, combined with rising nationalist movements across the colonies, made the empire unsustainable. One by one, colonies gained their independence, and Britain's role in the world changed forever. But the economic impact of the empire is undeniable. It transformed a small island into a global superpower and laid the foundations for the modern, globalized economy. The story of how the British Empire became the richest in history is a fascinating mix of trade, technology, military might, and financial acumen. It's a huge and complicated piece of our shared global history. So how did the British Empire collapse? The First World War was the first major shock. It was devastating. Britain and its empire mobilized millions of soldiers and spent a fortune. They won the war, but at a tremendous cost. The country was deeply in debt, mostly to the United States. This economic strain made it harder to afford the massive costs of maintaining a global empire. More importantly, the war shattered the myth of European superiority. Soldiers from the colonies fought and died alongside Europeans, and they returned home with new ideas about self-determination and national identity. The interwar period saw the rise of nationalist movements across the empire. In India, leaders like Mahatma Gandhi pioneered non-violent resistance, inspiring millions and putting immense pressure on British rule. The British government started making concessions, like the Government of India Act in 1935, which granted greater autonomy, but for many it was too little, too late. The demand for full independence was growing louder. Ireland also fought a brutal war of independence, resulting in the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922. This was a clear sign that Britain's grip was weakening closer to home. Economically, the Great Depression of the 1930s hit Britain hard, further reducing its ability to invest in and control its vast territories. The costs were simply becoming unsustainable. Then came World War II. This was the final, decisive blow. Britain stood against Nazi Germany, but the effort was Herculean. Cities were bombed, the economy was pushed to its absolute limit, and the country once again fell into massive debt. By the end of the war in 1945, Britain was victorious, but bankrupt and exhausted. The world had changed. Two new superpowers had emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both were ideologically opposed to old-style European colonialism. The US championed self-determination, while the Soviet Union supported anti-colonial movements as part of its Cold War strategy. Britain found itself caught between these two giants, with little power to resist the global tide turning against empire. The post-war Labour government, led by Clement Attlee, recognized that holding on to the empire was no longer politically or economically feasible. The first and most significant departure was India in 1947. The jewel in the crown was gone. The independence of India and Pakistan triggered a chain reaction. It sent a powerful message to other colonies. Freedom was achievable. The process wasn't always peaceful. The partition of India was a human catastrophe, with widespread violence and displacement. But the precedent was set. The 1950s and 60s saw a rapid wave of decolonization, often called the wind of change, a phrase famously used by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. One by one, colonies gained their independence. Ghana in 1957 was the first sub-Saharan African colony to do so, sparking a domino effect across the continent. Nigeria followed in 1960, Kenya in 1963, and many others. The process varied. Some transitions were negotiated peacefully, while others, like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, involved violent conflict. Each nation had its own unique struggle and path to sovereignty. A key moment that exposed Britain's diminished world status was the Suez Crisis of 1956. When Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, along with France and Israel, invaded. But they were forced into a humiliating withdrawal by intense political pressure from the United States. This event made it brutally clear that Britain was no longer a top-tier global power that could act independently. It could no longer project its power without American approval. This was a massive psychological blow and accelerated the pace of decolonization. It proved the empire was over. So how did the British Empire collapse? It wasn't one single event, but a perfect storm of factors. The economic ruin of 2 world wars, the rise of powerful nationalist movements inspired by ideals of freedom and self-determination, and the new world order dominated by the anti-colonial superpowers of the US and USSR. Britain simply couldn't afford its empire anymore, and the people living under its rule were no longer willing to accept it. The empire didn't really collapse in a dramatic explosion. It was more of a managed, sometimes messy, and often reluctant retreat. The legacy of the British Empire is complex and still debated today. It left behind systems of law, administration, and the English language, but also deep scars of exploitation, division, and conflict. The transition from empire to the Commonwealth of Nations is part of this story, an attempt to maintain ties and influence in a post-colonial world. The story of the empire's end is a powerful reminder that no power lasts forever, and that the desire for people to govern themselves is one of the most powerful forces in history. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through history interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next video. See you next time.